For 9 years, Margaret Hollis transferred calls about lost wallets, crying children, and broken vending machines. But the moment a voice on the other end whispered coordinates in Russian, she realized the hospital she'd given her life to was never just a hospital. Margaret Hollis had a gift that most people never thought to call a gift. She made chaos feel manageable. In the world of hospital reception, that wasn't a small thing. It was everything. For 9 years, she had been the calm center of Lakeview General's storm, seated behind the front desk of the main lobby from 7 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon, 5 days a week, with the reliability of a heartbeat. She knew every extension by memory. She knew which nurses preferred not to be paged during rounds, which doctors became irritable when their lunch was interrupted, and which family members in the waiting room were about to break into tears before they even opened their mouths. She had learned to read the lobby the way a sailor reads the sea, by its colors, its sounds, its silences, and the particular quality of tension that preceded a change in weather. She was not a dramatic woman. She did not fantasize about espionage or excitement. She drove a sensible grey sedan, kept a small vegetable garden on the weekends, and spent her evenings reading historical fiction and drinking chamomile tea. Her hair had gone silver somewhere around her 45th birthday, and she had accepted it without ceremony, pulling it back each morning into a neat bun that sat at the base of her neck with quiet authority. She wore a lanyard with her employee badge every single day, not because policy required it, but because she believed that people should know who they were speaking to. Accountability mattered to Margaret. It always had. The lobby of Lakeview General was, by any reasonable measure, unremarkable. Blue-grey walls chosen for their calming psychological effect, fluorescent panels recessed into a drop ceiling, a waiting area filled on most days with a rotating population of anxious parents, elderly patients clutching folders of paperwork, and teenagers staring into their phones. There were 2 security monitors on Margaret's desk, boxy, functional screens that cycled through camera feeds from the parking lot, the emergency entrance, the elevator banks, and the main corridor. She glanced at them the way one glances at a familiar painting, present, peripheral, rarely examined. On her right sat a multi-line phone console that rang, on average, 60 to 80 times per shift. She answered every call the same way, in a voice that was warm without being effusive. "Lakeview General, this is Margaret. How may I direct your call?" It was a Tuesday in November when everything changed. The lobby was quieter than usual, a residual stillness left over from a slow morning, the kind that made the fluorescent hum above her desk feel more audible than it actually was. She had transferred 4 calls in the last 20 minutes, eaten half of a granola bar, and was in the middle of updating a visitor log when the phone rang on line 3. She answered without looking up. "Lakeview General, this is Margaret. How may I direct your call?" There was a pause on the other end, not the confused pause of someone who had dialed the wrong number, not the hesitant pause of someone gathering nerve to ask about a patient. This pause had texture to it, a careful, deliberate quality, like someone pressing their thumb over a wound. And then the voice came, low and unhurried, and it was speaking Russian. Margaret had grown up in a household that moved. Her father had been an academic, a linguist specifically, and her childhood had been threaded through with languages the way other childhoods were threaded through with sports or music. She had never become fluent in Russian, but she had spent enough years listening to her father's colleagues, attending dinners where 3 languages were spoken simultaneously, and absorbing the architecture of Slavic phonetics, that she could recognize Russian not just as a language, but as a mood, as a set of shapes the mouth made under specific kinds of pressure. And what she heard now was not casual Russian. It was not the Russian of someone accidentally misdirected. The voice on the line was reading something. Numbers. Coordinates, she would later understand, though in the moment she only understood that they were numbers spoken with the precision of someone who could not afford to be wrong. And between the numbers, a word she did recognize, because her father had used it sometimes when he was translating documents he brought home from the university. Convert. Envelope. And then the call ended. She sat very still for a moment. She placed the phone receiver back in its cradle with the same gentle exactness she brought to everything she did. Her hand was steady. She was surprised, in a distant and observational way, that her hand was steady. She looked at the security monitor to her left. Camera 4, which covered the main corridor leading from the lobby toward the east wing, showed a man she did not recognize, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, wearing an olive-green shirt, standing just inside the frame with his back partially turned, his hand raised to his mouth in a gesture that looked less like thinking and more like waiting. She had been looking at that monitor for 9 years. She knew every maintenance worker, every regular visitor, every vendor who came through those corridors. She did not know this man, and he was looking, not at the nurse's station, not at the directory, not at his phone, but directly, with calm and practiced patience, at the front desk. At her. Margaret Hollis opened the bottom drawer of her desk. She removed a small notebook she had kept for 9 years, in which she wrote, in her neat and careful hand, things that did not belong, wrong numbers that called back twice, visitors who asked unusual questions, deliveries that arrived without documentation. She turned to a fresh page. She wrote the date, the time, and the word she had recognized. Then she picked up her personal cell phone, not the hospital line, and called a number that had been given to her 14 years ago by her father on the last night she ever saw him, with instructions she had always hoped she would never need to use. His name, as Margaret would eventually learn, was Daniel Reeves, and he was very good at looking like he belonged somewhere he did not belong. It was, in fact, the primary skill his work required, the ability to enter a space and flatten himself into its background, to adopt the posture and rhythm of someone whose presence required no explanation. He had been doing it for 11 years across 4 continents, and he had gotten very good at the particular subspecialty of hospital infiltration, which had its own grammar, its own costume logic, its own set of behavioral rules. Hospitals were useful because they were premised on the idea that anyone present was either suffering or helping someone who was suffering, and that premise generated a kind of social permission that was difficult to replicate in other environments. No one questioned a person standing quietly in a hospital corridor. Stillness read as grief or exhaustion or the suspended animation of waiting for news. Daniel had arrived at Lakeview General 40 minutes before the phone call was placed. He was there because of a man named Oleg Vasin, who had checked himself into the hospital's neurology unit 3 days earlier under the name Gerald Watts, complaining of migraines, and who was, in reality, a former FSB communications officer who had been carrying certain information in his head for the better part of a decade and had recently made a decision, arrived at slowly and at great personal cost, to share that information with someone who was not the Russian state. The arrangement had been delicate. The timing had been precise, and then, 40 minutes ago, something had shifted. Daniel didn't know what. He only knew that the extraction protocol had gone quiet at exactly the moment it was supposed to be loudest, and that the silence had the particular quality of a plan encountering an obstacle it had not anticipated. He had come to the lobby to run a visual assessment. He wanted to see the front desk, the security monitors, the traffic pattern through the main corridor. He wanted to understand whether the hospital's internal security had been altered in the last hour, whether any new personnel had appeared who did not match the institutional rhythm of the place. What he had not wanted, what he had not planned for in any version of the contingency map he carried in his head, was to watch the woman at the front desk answer a phone call, go completely still, and then reach for a personal cell phone with the controlled deliberateness of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and why. He moved toward the desk before he had fully decided to move toward it. This was something his instructors had drilled into him early. Sometimes the body completes the calculation before the conscious mind finishes the arithmetic. He rested his forearm on the counter and looked at her. She was already looking at him. Her eyes were steady behind her glasses, and what he saw in them was not fear, which he had expected, but recognition of a very specific kind. The recognition of someone who has been waiting for a thing to arrive and is now processing the fact of its arrival with as much efficiency as the situation permits. She lowered the phone from her ear and held it loosely in one hand. "You were on camera 4, she said quietly, in the manner of someone stating a fact rather than making an accusation. "For 11 minutes, she paused. "That's a long time to stand in a corridor without moving toward anything." He said nothing. She set her cell phone face down on the desk, which he understood correctly as a signal that the call had already been made and that whatever was going to happen next was already in motion. "Room 4114, she said, even more quietly. "East Wing. He hasn't eaten since yesterday morning and he's been asking the night nurse whether anyone has checked the parking garage." She held his gaze with an evenness that he found, under the circumstances, remarkable. "I've been answering phones here for 9 years. I know when someone is waiting to be found." What happened in the next 4 hours would later be compressed into the dry language of debriefs and incident reports. A carefully coordinated movement through the hospital's service corridors, a brief and tense negotiation with a night security supervisor who had noticed something irregular on camera 4, a rendezvous in the hospital's basement loading bay, and the quiet departure of a man named Oleg Vasin in the back seat of an unmarked vehicle that had been idling in the parking structure since 2 in the afternoon. Margaret would be interviewed 3 times in the weeks that followed, once by a man who identified himself as federal law enforcement, once by 2 people who did not identify themselves at all, and once, unexpectedly, by a woman who arrived at her vegetable garden on a Saturday morning and asked questions about her father that Margaret had not heard anyone ask in 14 years. She returned to work the following Monday. She answered the phones. She transferred calls about lost wallets and broken vending machines and patients who needed directions to radiology. She updated the visitor log and ate half a granola bar at 10:30 and watched the camera feeds cycle through their familiar rotation. And when the phone on line 3 rang at 2:17 in the afternoon, she answered it the same way she had answered it for 9 years, in the same warm and steady voice, and discovered it was a woman asking about parking validation. She helped her. She always helped. That had never been the part in question. The part in question was what you did when the ordinary instrument of your ordinary life suddenly transmitted something it was never supposed to carry. And Margaret Hollis, daughter of a linguist, keeper of a small notebook, woman of steady hands, had answered that question too, in her own quiet way, just as she answered everything else. She had picked up the phone. She had listened, and she had known exactly who to call.